Hello, this is Gretchen Baskerville, the author of The Life-Saving Divorce, Hope for People Leaving Destructive Relationships. In 2019, I interviewed David for Chapter 9 in my book, the chapter on male victims of abuse and betrayal. David's story was so powerful and shocking that it changed the way I saw men and marital abuse. At the time, his divorce had finalized, but there were still issues with custody and some parenting turmoil, and he had recently remarried. In this interview, we catch up with the good news of his life today, and then I ask him to tell the story of his first marriage. I am so excited to re-interview you, David, because I interviewed you for the book, The Life-Saving Divorce. You're in Chapter 9. You're the first story in Chapter 9. It just touched me so much. And since then, your story has been one of the most powerful stories in the book. And so I wanted to circle back around, and you mentioned that you'd be willing to do a podcast. There's a part of me that just wants to go, how are you doing now?
Actually, fantastic. My wife and I we're married now almost 3 years. So, and it's like one of those things, it's night and day between what my life was before and what married life is now. I mean, just the level of communication and, being peers. I mean, like that was the thing I always wanted. I just wanted a peer. I wanted a friend. I wanted a peer that could go through life with me. And my wife is all those things in spades. I can't believe how lucky I've gotten with being with her.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's absolutely fabulous.
Yeah, I mean it's fantastic. It's one of those things that you want someone, the person that you're with, to be able to understand you, and to be able, like, so that you almost have a common language of being able to talk. And like I think we're supposed to complement each other in the right senses, meaning like, we all have oscillations. We're good days or bad days or something like that. And having someone else there, just kind of helps modulate those two things, and being able to bounce ideas off, and that I'm just not talking like I've got two heads, to someone that has no idea what's going on. And then can challenge me in good ways, in good and helpful ways. It not just accusatory. I mean, just so much of my life, in my previous marriage was just accusations. And so I spent most of my time being defensive about things rather than trying to solve things. Cause it's like, we're never going to do the right thing. I mean, I got married so young, I didn't know how to do this.
There are so many men who need to hear your story, but there's also a lot of women who need to understand that men can be victims of abuse and betrayal as well. Also, there are a lot of adult children who wished that their dad had divorced their narcissistic mom. I'm not saying that's what your first wife was, but she was a difficult woman. I want them to see what happens when a man finally does say enough is enough, and he breaks with the tradition that he was brought up in and says, no, I've got a divorce. So take us from the very beginning. Tell us a little bit about your growing up, your home, what you believed about marriage, what you were taught about marriage, and what kind of example did you see in your parents?
Sure. Well, I grew up in, I'm sure it's familiar with some of your listeners, like the Sovereign Grace group of churches. Like my family was like a really early on version of that in one of the Northern Virginia churches. And so growing up, homeschooling was a prominent thing. I always like to say I'm the second wave of homeschoolers. That, the first waves were the ones that were kind of hiding out from the government. And then when the laws changed, you could kind of live more openly. And that's when I started. Around that same time, like, Josh Harris was still in school and starting to do his New Attitude things. Like, I remember going to a couple of the early New Attitude ones where there was like maybe 40 or 50 people in the room, while he was, still in high school.
Now explain to people who he is.
So Josh Harris was the guy that wrote the book I Kissed Dating Goodbye, which was a owner's manual, I guess, for complementarian churches and how to raise your sons and daughters to approach dating and getting marriage moving forward. Um, it is it is a noble concept that he wanted, but he wrote it when he first of all wasn't married, and number two, it's just one of those things that if people were sinless, the book would be great and would follow along. But it's or if people were completely healthy in their relationships and knew how to be humble. I mean, I would say the greatest characteristic of being able to be married is someone that is humble, because we're all going to make mistakes and not do the right thing. But as long as you find a partner that's humble and that can admit to their mistakes and communicate that and communicate wanting to do better and putting others more than themselves. So, Kiss Dating Goodbye was like a big prominent one where this is a concept that you don't date around, you don't give away pieces of your heart. You're basically, if you're dating, you're basically practicing for divorce, and divorce is the worst thing in the world. And I remember growing up thinking, here, arrogantly, and I repent of this all the time. Is thinking when I heard someone getting divorced, I was like, well, they just didn't try hard enough. And I was like, and my family growing up was very a personality. I've got two brothers, and all of us have either tried to start our own businesses or excelled in their field of study.
You're go-getters. You come from a
Right,
family of go-getters.
right. I remember in therapy they always talked about what was the motto of your family, and the motto in my family was always "Don't be mediocre. You can choose to do whatever you want, but you better not be mediocre." And so all of us strived very hard. So I started homeschooling halfway through first grade. I went all the way to graduation, and all during that time it was like it was always held out that marriage was the peak of your Christian experience, because that's the way Christ describes the church as his bride, and we're supposed to emulate that. So therefore you're just waiting till the moment where you arrive and being married. And so I mean, honestly, I made it an idol, but it was sort of one of those encouraged idols in the church that I was in. Encouraged titles, people always say, it's like, oh well, wait till you get married, it's the greatest thing in the world, and it's like, okay. So I remember just deciding as very young that I was like, I'm going to be the best husband in the world. I'm going to pay attention to everything that goes on. I'm going to listen as best I can. I'm going to figure out the things that people love to do for their wives, and I'm going to just make a list of these things and be the best possible husband I possibly can. I didn't date at all the way up until college, and then it's just sort of like, but there's always this anticipation of when you meet a young lady that you find attractive. It was like, oh well, I can't be too attracted to them because that would be lusting, but how do I find out about this person? And so you generally just go really, you look, quote unquote, look for signs that you feel like God's leading you to do. And I think that is one of the poor examples of things. Is just, there's a mysticism that comes with it that's not based off of reality. And when there's mysticism and it's tied up in emotion and idolatry, you sort of miss the red flags.
Yeah,
Like
I
the
mean, I always
glaring red.
call that the formula thinking, or God is being the giant Coke machine in the sky. If I
Yes.
just do the right things, or God will give me a sign, or God will tell me, if I just, obey in these ways and I follow this formula, this courtship formula, it's going to turn out okay automatically.
Right. Right. And it's sort of one of the funny things is it builds in your mind that you're not supposed to, there was no, in the kind of the kiss dating goodbye courtship mindset, there was no training on how do you pull the ripcord when something's wrong. Like
Mm.
there was no concept of, it was like if people got around you and gave you the thumbs up, you just kept taking it to the next logical step and the next step and the next step and the next step. There was no evaluation process. Everything that was described was like, oh, well, are they a Christian? Do they read the Bible? Do they go to church? It was all these really simple things for people to do, but not have a heart, like not have it in their heart. It was all these overt things that you pay attention to.
Yeah, symbols, signals of virtue, but not necessarily the reality of virtue.
Right. And so it's like, or even how to evaluate what a red flag is. Like I just remember just not being I remember some explicit red flags that occurred when I was dating my ex-wife, my first wife, and just completely going as like, well, that she just needs someone that cares about her. And if I just care about her enough, I'll give her this space because there's all these other things that I see that she does that I think are good things. And so you don't see these glaring red flags. I mean, it was things like, I mean, early on, it was her family was even like, oh, her family was telling me, don't date her. She lies.
Wow.
Um,
Okay.
and I remember bringing this up, and then my first wife, when I was dating her, she was just like, oh, well, they just don't like me. There was always this concept of other people don't like me. I'm so unfairly treated. Um, and then I got very like defensive of her about these things, and to the point of her aunt and cousins and stuff like that were actually how I met her. It's like, so there was a family in the church that I was going to in college that sort of adopted me and my brother as their quote unquote college kids. We would go over and have meals with them, and they were a great family. And it was their niece was my first wife. And so that was a good relationship. I mean, I would stay up with her aunt into, late into the night, talking about theology, talking about different things. And immediately when we started dating and her aunt was like, you need to be careful.
Wow.
You need to be careful with my niece. She lies. I got it in spades from this. And it was like this primary relationship before I had the relationship with my first wife was telling me, this is not okay. You got
Wow.
to be careful. And I remember already not questioning my first wife at all and just going, oh, well, because we had already gone through, multiple stages of the kind of the courtship process. And it was like, oh, now it's my job to defend her
Mm.
against the things that, her family was doing.
Can we stop for just a second? Because you brought
Sure.
up a couple of things. One thing is this concept that you saw that she, had some needs, and you felt that. I think what you're going to tell me is that, you as Christians, we're taught that the love of Jesus in me, or the love of God in me, will heal that other person when they see the godly love in my life and the good example from my family. They will be healed, or maybe that's not quite the right word, but you get what I'm saying, kind of that
Yes.
it will fix them. My godly example will fix them.
Well, the idea is that you're basically providing the garden for them to grow into the person that you want them to be, or
Mm.
you think that God wants them to be, or I think we're amazing at convincing ourselves that people can be different. I mean, this may sound super cynical, but I actually don't. I think it's very difficult for people to change. I think uh, brain psychology now just basically puts it as like you can sort of minimize your negative impact of things that you have out there, but by the time people are adults, it's very difficult for them to change their behavior. And I remember just thinking, all it takes is love. You can knock off the rough edges. It's like if you just give them time and you are the stone in the river, they'll come around. And that's all you need to do. You just need to not give up. If I don't give up, if I believe in them, they will change.
Yeah, yeah, and then it's we're there's a limit to how much we can rescue a person. I mean, some people just another great partner is enough to get them going on the right course, and for other people their personality difficulties are deeply ingrained and there's no way you're going to move them. So tell us about what happened next. So you saw that red flag. I mean, you didn't see that red flag, and that's a huge one. Tell me more.
Yeah. So, my previous wife, when we were dating, she was way more physical than I was. So one of the other flags was that she had a very bad relationship with her parents while she was living at home, and and so a lot of it was like trying to get out of their house, and she used her physicality as a means to communicate comfort and would want me to participate in that. Now, I always grew up in the mindset of like, you're not supposed to, um, premarital sex was bad. It's not an okay thing to do. It's frowned on by God. It's like dirtying, it's soiling and stuff like that. But also I was a young male in college or some, and if this very attractive woman is wanting to relate to you in a physical aspect, it gets very hard to say no. And a lot of times, like, I would set up boundaries of like, I don't want to do this, but they would just, go through it. And I remember this one time, we were driving down the road, and she had just had a huge fight with her mom. And she was like, I want you to pull over and have sex with me, while we were driving the car. And I remember saying, no, I'm driving the car. We're going somewhere. This is like, I don't want to do this. And she was like, if you don't do this, I'll know that you don't love me. All I want you to do is comfort me. What's wrong with comforting me by doing this? And I remember pulling over into a banking parking lot and having sex and just being like, this is not right. This is not what I wanted. But like, here she's setting up, if you don't do what I want, you are communicating that you don't care about me, and therefore, this is, then you're actually saying this thing, which is what I don't, which nothing that I wanted to do. I wanted to be caring and loving, and and stuff like that. So there wasn't
here she is. She's coercing you. She's threatening you basically to have sex when that goes against your moral code, your moral values. It's not that you're against sex, but
right.
you shouldn't be coerced.
Yeah.
And what did you tell yourself to stay in the relationship at that point?
Well, I mean, at that point, I was like, since we had already had sex at that point, I felt like I was committed. Like I could not back out of this
Because of your Christian teachings said once you've had sex, you're married or you have to get
right.
married. Yeah.
You're one flesh. I mean, a lot of that was doing. I was like, okay, and we started having sex for a while, and I remember this just eating away at me. And I remember, Sovereign Grace had these things called Celebration, which was like a meeting of all the churches together to go to like a mini conference that usually lasted about a week. And I remember going there, and I remember this sermon that I was listening to, and it was like, I remember to this day, it was from the Old Testament. It was just, the preacher was just talking about the measurements of the tabernacle in the Old Testament and how particular they were. And the reason for them being so particular was because he's a holy God and wants to draw near to his people. And he was basically putting up this thing for people to come near to him. And I just remember God moving on my heart about this and saying, I just felt like I was distancing myself from God because I knew what he was saying in my heart about that this was wrong. And here I was doing it. So, I remember taking, my ex-wife, who was dating at the time, aside and saying, look, we need to include people in this. Like, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't think we're good at like keeping temptation away from ourselves or something like that. We need accountability. We need people up there. And she read me the riot act. She tried every single thing in the book to not include people in this conversation. I mean, she threatened to leave me. She threatened those things, but I felt so convicted at that point that we needed to do the right thing that we went and told, a pastor of ours that was in the place. And, I also told my parents, which was stupid. That was like, because they got really upset and they did not handle it very well. But the pastor that we went to actually handled it really well. And but like, to me, that again, that was another red flag, that when push comes to shove, nothing was off the table for her to use to try to get me not to do what I felt was right and what I felt like God was calling me to do.
So she was incredibly manipulative. She would use anything. She wanted to silence you, keep you
Right.
isolated from others. Here's a deep moral conflict you're wrestling with in your soul, and she doesn't want you to talk to anyone. And thank God you reached out to people and let people know what was going on. I mean, not that that helped with your parents.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I still to this day feel very, very glad and felt like God was calling me to do that. And it's like one of those things. Hindsight's 2020. Remember, I was talking about humility was a big thing. She never admitted that she thought that that was wrong.
Mm.
Like, in the very least, if you have a different moral code about sex and premarital sex is one thing, but when your significant other was like, this is causing me emotional pain, this activity, and you're not even willing to say, I understand that, like, that is another really big flag.
Yeah.
It's like that she didn't care about that I was violating my conscience. She just didn't want to have to deal with the consequences of telling somebody and bringing accountability into our
No
relationship.
empathy. It's really no empathy, isn't it? She does it'd be one thing if you apologized and said, I'm so sorry for making you cross your boundaries. I know you feel really, really bad about this. But it sounds like she justified everything.
Yeah. So everything was justified. Nothing was wrong. But I came out of that whole experience feeling very confident. I was like, okay, well, I can hear God, and I'm going to do what's right, regardless of the consequences or relational strife or something like that comes through it. And I always chalked it up to a important part of our marriage moving forward towards a good marriage was that I stood up and said that shouldn't do this.
Yeah, agreed.
Um, but also, it's like, but I feel like it's also one of those things that I don't know if you've ever, like, there's hazing. There's a bunch of science around hazing, that the reason why hazing is so important for groups is that you make it through this hell of a thing, and you come out to the other side, and it creates this trauma bond that that then builds your relationship over.
Mm.
And I think that was a strand of trauma bonding that we went through, not in a good sense, you
Mm.
know.
Mm.
So we ended up getting married, and then and we had our first child, about 2.5 years later. I wanted, again, that was one of those things. I wanted us to be married just for 5 years to kind of figure out how to relate to each other. And she wanted to, she didn't want to finish her school, and so she wanted to get pregnant. And so I remember holding it off and saying, I just, I don't feel like this is what we should be doing. I mean, I don't think we should have children just right away. And what she ended up doing was buying a little jumper for a little kid, and surprising me by putting it against my shoulder.
Mm.
And it was like, don't you want a little person there holding you and holding your shoulder? I mean, it was like not even a conversation. It was like a parlor trick to get to do it.
Mm.
Um,
Mm. Did you feel
now,
coerced at the time, or were you feeling like,
absolutely not.
okay, you felt like what?
At the time, I thought, oh, this is a really clever way of getting me to see what it would be like to be a dad.
Mm.
So, I was actually, I was very happy, and man, I really love my kids. I don't want that to make it sound like that I'm upset with having my 3 kids, because oh man, they're wonderful, uh, and they're just like massive joys to me. Um, but it was like, one of those things that we couldn't have a conversation about it. It was like, it was like, I just need to try a different tactic to get what I
Mm.
want. And again, at the time I was like, well, I mean, one of the other taxes that she used is like, well, I don't want to work, I don't want to do school. This is the thing that I want to be. Don't you want me to be exactly who I want to be? And can't you support me? And things would just ratchet up to where I am only supporting my life, not supporting her life. And I'm like, oh gosh, that's not back to my day of my list of things that I want to do is like, well, I want to be the most supportive husband possible. So I'm going to do that.
Right, right. Yeah. So whatever she wants. I mean, you evaluate yourself from what you've heard about bad husbands. Bad husbands don't listen to their wives, they don't care about their feelings. And but what that ends up becoming is a message that happy wife, happy life, which is if you give the wife everything, then your life will be happy, but that doesn't always work out that way.
No, no, it doesn't. So, you know, and so during this time, I mean, it's hard. People often ask me, is like, well, was it horrible from the beginning in your marriage? And it's like, I, I, it's funny. I don't think I would have thought it was horrible at that time because I had the impression that it, marriage was always just so difficult. It was always a difficult. So there's this weird dichotomy of this is the greatest thing in the world, that the pinnacle of your Christianity is becoming a husband and wife and moving towards that, and this is the hardest thing in the world for you guys to do. So I just like took it in stride that difficult ways were doing. I didn't know what was normal. I didn't know what normal arguments were supposed to look like. Were normal arguments supposed to look like, raising your voices at each other and doing that? It was cold shoulder. I remember we didn't disagree. I was always brought up with the concept that you stay in the same room. You stay together until you finish having your argument. It's like you have to resolve arguments because sun cannot set on, your anger and stuff like that. These stupid platitudes that, like, now later on I'm looking at it and just going, oh my gosh, I don't see this as being really biblical.
Yeah, it is a platitude, and there are times that it's just not wise. I mean, you've got a serious problem and it can't be solved, before the sun goes down. And there's some marriage endangering sin going on that's so serious, you don't want to just sweep it under the carpet.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that I think we don't have a good idea or a grasp on, taking the time to be circumspect about your contribution. And so, I remember, we sort of started evaluating our lives. I always thought it was about intimacy, and we sort of associated sexual activity with intimacy.
Mm.
And it was just like, if we're having sex, then we were being, quote unquote, being intimate, because I had no concept of this relational intimacy where it was just communicating back and forth.
Mm.
And so we would have these huge blow up arguments, and then it would be like, oh, are we, and then my wife would be like, let's have sex, and then we'll be okay. And then it was just like pushing everything else away. And it was like, oh, well, since we're doing this and being physically intimate, then we have, quote unquote, intimacy.
So the arguments never got resolved. You just had
No,
sex.
right. And I don't ever remember her ever admitting to doing anything wrong. I remember
Mm.
I would always come back, we'd have an argument and I'd be like, I know that there was a lot of gaslighting of like, I know I'm bringing up reasonable things like the finances, like we blew through the budget. And her first accusation was like, well, I wouldn't have blown through the budget if you had spent the evening going over um, my budget items and seen what I spent so that I could know. And I was like, well, that's not really what handling the budget is. I mean, like, I was like, I right around that time I'd done my first startup. And I was working like 12, 13 hours a day. I mean, I remember when my son was born, he was born in the morning. And by that afternoon, I was working a full 8-hour day. I like basically took the morning off for the birth of my son and then started working at the rest of that day.
That's the life
Um,
of the startup entrepreneur, that's for sure.
right, right. And it would be like, and so we would be having these arguments and I'd be like, I cannot do all the things that I'm doing. And, I work in the tech field. So like I am, I'm afforded a really good salary. And I remember having a discussion. I was like, well, we're blowing through the budget. I'm going into our savings to cover over these budget items. I need to trust you that you can stay on budget. And she'd be like, well, you're not being a good spiritual leader. If you were being a good spiritual leader, we'd be praying about what we're spending money on. We'd be, doing, you'd be tracking with me during the week or something like that. Can't you do more? And I just kept thinking, oh, well, I just have to do more and more. So we'd go away from these conversations. And then my always response was, well, I can't change her, but I can change myself. So I just need, marriage is it's not 50-50, it's 100% on both parts. I was like, so my job is just to keep giving 100% as much as I can and keep giving and giving. And then, maybe it's a maturity thing, maybe it's a family thing, that she just doesn't know how to handle money. And I just need to give her time. And I need to do more work to give her more guardrails. But every single structure I put up, it just kept blowing through and it kept getting worse and worse.
Well, I remember when I interviewed you a year and a half or 2 years ago, I was really impressed with how you actually came to her, put it all out on the table and said, this is the budget. What input would you like? How much do you think we ought to be spending? What would you like to spend next year? What major purchases do we need to do? And you really asked you weren't kind of authoritative or authoritarian and just said, well, this is what we're going to do. And this is all I'm going to give you. You really worked with her to try to build a budget that was very livable for both of you.
Yeah, and I remember I had my budgetary, and so it started getting to the point of where all my budgetary items, I would underspend my budgetary items that we had to do so that I could make up for the blowing over on the other side. So like I would put off things that I wanted to do, vacations or fun things that we would do, and we would get in arguments over that. She'd be like, well, you promised me a vacation, or we could go do this or that, and I'd be like, but we overran the budget and we don't have that money anymore. And then I was the bad person for like, then it became my problem that I wasn't handling the money correctly.
Right. And
And
you've told me she didn't just, it's not like she bought $100 too much groceries. She
oh
made
no,
major purchases.
I mean, I remember it would be like I'd come home and there would be a new piece of furniture in the house, and I'd be like, where did that come from? And she'd be like, well, you don't have to look at that empty space every day. You're away at work and working all the time, and this will make me happy. And every expenditure of money was always couched, this is for the family. And I'd be like, I understand that it's for the family, but where is this money coming from? It's like, it doesn't. And she'd be like, well, you'll figure it out.
Mm.
And so I kept figuring it out and figuring it out, and we would go into debt. And like I do startups, and so there's a lot of times where I didn't make a salary, and so we would build up money, and then, or I had a couple of good exits, and we would have money aside and a fixed amount, and be like, there is no extra money coming in, we have to make this last, and we blow through it in half the time. Trying to make up for it, which is very stressful because I'm trying to build a company at the same time as watching, the thing. And so it compounds to my thing. I was like, I'm being a terrible husband. I'm not providing for my family. I'm working really hard, and stuff like that. And, I was in serious depression, towards the end of our marriage. I was just like, I'm a complete failure. One of my startups failed at the same time. We were running out of money. It was emotional. And then I remember for one particular startup that we did, I remember sitting down with her and this CEO of the company I was going to join for the startup. and going through all the things that could go right and all the things that could go wrong, and saying, like, this is risky. I was like, unless you and I are 100% on board with this, we're not doing this, because that's what I believe. I believe I cannot do this alone. I have to do with it. And she would say things like, well, I trust you. I trust that you're the person that is going to make the right decision about it. It's like, yeah, it was like, this may not work. We may get 2 years down the road and have nothing to show for this. Are you going to be okay with that? Because I'm going to be okay with that. But if you're not going to be okay with that, then I'm just going to get a traditional job, because what's more important to me is our family operates as a unit. And she said yes. And then 2 years later, things weren't working. We were running out of money. And it was like, you never told me that we would actually fail or not have money. So at the same time, I'm hearing, you're not caring for me. You're working too hard. I mean, she would call me up in the middle of the day and say, can you come home? And I'd be like, what's happened? Is something going on? And she would say, no, I'm just tired and don't want to have to deal with the kids. And I'd be like, I'm at work. So if there's an emergency, I absolutely can push off the things. But if you just don't want to deal with the kids anymore, it's like, I don't know if I can stop doing that. And so I would make compromises. Like, I would come down in the middle of the day, play with the kids, and then work till midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning to try to get the time in. So it's like I was constantly adjusting my life. We even started moving like an hour and a half away from where my job was, so that I would commute 3 hours a day so that she could be out in the country, because she wanted to have a garden. It's like we make all these compromises trying to make peace. And there are some people that you can't make peace with.
Yeah.
And honestly, towards the end, I knew what kind of person my ex-wife, my first wife, needed to be. She actually needed someone that didn't care, that actually was kind of stoic and didn't could handle, kind of like who her dad was. Like, her mom would yell at her dad, and he would just read his newspaper till it blew over, and then say, "Are you done?" And just like, no care. She wanted to have somebody to. I'm a little bit more an emotional person. Like, if you say you're doing a bad job, or I think you're a terrible husband, I actually believed it, because same thing. Growing up, we were always taught that you are a bad evaluator of your own heart. In church, it was like, when you look in the mirror, you're looking at like a funhouse mirror. It's like, it's completely distorted from reality, and you need outside people to tell you what's going on and inside. And I was like, well, the most significant relationship I have is my wife. And so if she's telling me I'm this bad person, then I must be this bad person.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So,
and that's not going to go well, I can tell. Because as Christians, of course, we are taught to be pathologically nice, and we have to be nice all the time, and we have to be agreeable all the time, and we really, really care what other people think of us. It never occurs to us that person may have some, that their judgment, it may be completely off. We trust them, we believe them, and we want to please them at all costs.
Right. So, so I just kept sinking deeper and deeper into depression, to the point of where I was suicidal at that time, because the only thing I thought of was like, if I'm this terrible husband, and this is the one thing I wanted to do well, I wanted to be a good husband so bad, that I made my vows, and it says, till death do us. I remember thinking, it's like, till death do us part. And I remember thinking, it's like, well, that's my only way out. It's like, she'll be better off without me. And the thing that kept preventing me from doing it was, like, I couldn't figure out how to do it in such a way that my kids didn't know I had done it. Mm-hmm. I was like, I didn't want to saddle them with that burden. And so I was like, the moment I figure it out, then I'll do this. And that way everybody's life can be better without me. Which really, my, ex-wife at the time sort of really, she didn't like that. And so her thing was just to say, you're being selfish. That's the most selfish thing that you could possibly do. It's just another example of you trying to take the easy way out. and not caring for me and stuff like that. And I don't know if you've ever talked to people who are in that depression, that sort of language does not really help.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. To no empathy.
Right. So, our relationship had deteriorated to the point where, it was just constant fighting, and I was so depressed, and I remember us having a really big argument, and in the middle of the argument, she was like, "Well, let's just have sex." And I remember thinking, she had just previously said, "I don't think you love me at all because you're acting this way." And I just remember thinking, well, I don't really want to have sex with somebody that thinks that I don't love them. I was like, well, what's the point of doing that if with that? And I said that, I was like, no, I don't want to. No, I don't want to. And she said, yes, let's do it. Let's do it. Let's do it. And kind of kept pushing me on it. And I remember, I made the bad comment of, that maybe we should buy her a vibrator, so that she could satisfy herself without having to have me there. And what she said is like, I don't need to get a vibrator. I can get volunteers, meaning that she was willing to have an affair to, to break our marriage. And that was sort of like the last straw for me. I was crushed, because it was like, that was the thing. It was like, hey, you have just failed ultimately. If you're driving your wife into another person's arm, this is all your fault for not being caring and not doing enough. And we sort of, I just didn't want to do it at that time. And so we went to bed, and when we woke up in the morning, I was going away on a business trip. I was like, well, in the past, what we would just do here is we would be intimate, and, I'll go away on my trip. And I remember we started, being intimate together, and all it was running through my mind was that, she was going to get volunteers and I'm a terrible person. And I just became really upset and angry and just like stopped. And I would say that was not anywhere near a loving, intimate interaction at that point. It didn't do what it had before, where it's like faked this concept of intimacy or something like that. So, we left there, and I remember just mentioning, as like, well, she was like, well, I think we're over that, that she knew that it was different too at that time. And so, I left on a business trip. And at that same time, we'd also been taught in our church that secular therapy was an example of failure. And so I had no concept of going to marriage counselors. It's like, if you just don't go to the pastors, like, that's what you did. You went to the pastors, and pastors are not equipped for like personality disorders or mental illness or things like that. They're just not equipped properly to do those sort of things. So on my way back, I had decided I was going to give this one more shot. I wasn't going to commit suicide. I called a pastor friend of mine and was like, oh, we're going to, do this. But unbeknownst to me, my wife had gone to our other pastor and basically said, he sexually assaulted me. And they went to the police, and then I got arrested.
Oh my gosh.
On the plane, coming back from my business trip. And this is just sort of compounding on these things. And I was just thinking, we had, a conversation. I was like, well, I did get upset. I did get angry. And so that must have been, what she was talking about, was doing it. But then on the side, she was telling me, she was like, this is the only way I could figure out for you to get help.
So she just did it as a way of forcing you to take the whole thing seriously.
Yeah, to take the whole thing seriously, and for me to go into therapy, because honestly, I had been resistant to therapy because I felt like it was like a failure to think, but I had already agreed to doing it. And so I ended up going into inpatient care at this place down in Mississippi, that does sex addiction and and love addiction.
Now,
And so,
how did this work out? Because you were arrested by the police. How were you able to do this?
so as a part of the process, she kept pushing for me to go into inpatient care because she thought I would need it. And this is like one of those weird turn of events that, like, just by the grace of God, I 100% agree with my ex-wife that I needed to go into inpatient care. I mean, you don't be suicidal and depressed to the level that I was and not need to get help, and not need to get help from professionals that know what they're doing. And so it was just sort of something that we worked out in there. She was like, well, I want you to go to inpatient care. And again, I was like, I'll do whatever you want.
And
So
the
I went
police
down.
were okay with that. You weren't in jail or
Well,
anything.
yeah. So the thing about this stuff is it was super flimsy case. Like, it was like there was no physical evidence of anything like untoward or anything like that. It was like her saying that it happened and me saying, well, I was angry. And so it was it. There's like a function in the law for going into therapy and doing like intensive therapy. So I found the best institute in America for sex and love addiction and went into that program. Now, I went. It was like a 45-day program. It was the best thing that has ever happened to me. I mean, I
Wow.
cannot begin to describe how wonderful it was. The first time I remember in my entire life feeling safe was going
Wow.
into this place, because everything was very regimented and all I had to do was work on myself. I didn't have outside voices yelling at me. I was reading tons of material that they had. And it was funny, it's like it wasn't a Christian organization. They have they're very open to spirituality and stuff like that. But going down there, it was the first time I'd actually understood the gospel. It was like,
Wow.
the concept of, Paul talks about, I do the very things I don't want to do, and do the things I don't want to do. In Romans 7, that's like addiction and stuff like that. So I went down there with my mindset set as like, oh, well, I've got sex addiction or something like that because of the intimacy. And it turns out, with all the tests and stuff like that, I tended more towards love addiction, which is really this concept that you are willing to debase yourself for a significant other and blow through your morals, do things that you don't feel comfortable with. And so we picked this place because it was like, it had a really good family program. So you went down for like 3 weeks, and there was 1 week with the family and then another final week of doing stuff. And I'm very grateful for my time there. And I remember during our week where we were a couple, where they sort of kind of taught you boundaries, this concept of boundaries. Oh my gosh. Like, there's these things where people can't force you to do things that you don't want to do. Like, you've got to say, look, and then understanding that there are things that I need to work on, and then there's things that they need to work on, and I don't need to take on those things. I don't need to take the trauma bond on of those items.
They've got their issues that they have to work on. You have your issues that only you can work on, and you
Right.
keep your boundaries about that. That's great.
Right. And I remember down there, towards the end, after they had met my wife, I remember sitting down with my therapist down there, and she wisely said that unless your wife works on her issues, you guys are not going to be together.
Wow.
Um,
How did you feel when you heard that?
Honestly, after all that time, I sort of, it made sense to me for the first time. But I had put on basically a new hat, where I realized, I was like, look, we cannot be in the toxic relationship that we had before. We had to involve a lot of people in our lives because we did not do it well. So we needed accountability, and we needed people in our lives, around the clock. And she needed to do work on herself. Now, during the same time, like, because of what she accused me of, she had been working with her therapist, and her therapist was like, look, when he comes back, he's got to find a new apartment. And she was like, no, I don't want him to have a new apartment. I need him to co-parent with the kids. So I'm just going to buy a bigger house, we're just going to rent a really big house and he's going to be in the basement. And her therapist at that time was like, well, that doesn't really make sense. If he is the monster that you're describing him to be, you shouldn't want him in your house. And she was like, no, I've got 100% control of the situation. And what
Mm.
she meant was that she felt like she had this thing over top of me. And I remember moved into the house together. I was in the basement. We co-parented during this whole time. And then we were doing couples therapy with her therapist. And at some point, her therapist at that time, like, she was just mean. I mean, it was like first time that you would have somebody there, and how she talked to me. She was talking to me in front of another person. It's like, well, a lot of things happen behind closed doors, but like when you are out in the open and people are watching, she would, like, her therapist would be like, whoa, you can't really say things like that to him. And she'd be like,
Oh,
well, why not?
she's criticizing your wife, not you. Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't understand that part of the story. So she's
Yeah.
criticizing your wife.
Yes. So she was like, you can't talk to him like that. And she was like, well, then we're going to go to somebody else.
Oh,
And
wow.
so this started the whole process of us jumping from therapist to therapist, because it worked like clockwork. It worked really well in the beginning. People would be very sensitive. And then at some point they would say, well, where are you working on your stuff that we're saying? And she'd be like, well, you don't understand that he has tricked you into believing that he's not such a bad person. So her therapist ended up becoming my group therapist. And it was funny during that time. I mean, like, she just bolted on this lady. And she was my group therapist at that point.
So your
Um,
wife left therapy.
yes. And
Okay.
so she wouldn't do it. And then at that time, all my therapists, like, I'd be constantly saying, can we come back? Let's do couples therapy. Let's do this together. Like, we want to make this work. I want to make this work. Do you want to make this work? And so we would go through 6 months time where she wanted to be married to me, and then 6 months time where she doesn't, and she'd be like, you're the worst person in the world. I don't want to be married to you at all. And so it was this constant seesaw back and forth. And then finally we had gone through about 4 different therapists and 2 different moves to try to make her happy. And then at some point I just said, we're not doing this anymore. It's like, you are going to need to go into inpatient care. Like, I went into inpatient care because it was really good for me. You need to be able to deal with your issues. Do you want to do that? I was like, because that's what I want to do. That's what I'm willing to do here. And she said, no, I don't want to do that anymore. I don't want to be married.
Mm.
And I said, okay. But it was like one of those things. I always tell people ask me a lot of times, like, how did you know when you were done? And I was like, it's different for each person. They have to figure out something that makes sense to them so that they can be confident that God is calling them out of their marriage.
Mm.
Because there's so many hardships that come, there's so many things that go on, that you have to come up with something. And I also tell people at that point, I had been drummed into my mind. So we got back together for like another 2 years after that. Is that what was constantly drummed into my mind was what a healthy relationship was supposed to look like. And so this is one of the things that, like, I always tell people when they talk about their challenges in their marriage or something like that, and they don't know, or family members come to me and say, my daughter or son is in this terrible relationship. How do I convince them to get out of it?
Mm.
And it was like, I always tell people, never come at it head on and say that's a bad relationship, because that basically digs people in. What you need to constantly do is remind people of what a healthy relationship. Oh, guess what? You getting hit, that's not healthy. That's not normal. There is no element of that that's normal in a healthy relationship. Oh, you're getting yelled at, or your finances are being torn down, or they're keeping finances for you, or in affairs or something like that. It was like, those are hallmarks of poisonous relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the things. And so you address and keep constantly reminding people of what good relationships look like. And then people kindly, finally come around to understanding well, that's not me. That's not what my relationship is, and maybe that's a toxic relationship.
Yeah, I'll never forget. Somebody said, this was online, this was on Facebook, and they said, how do you deal with your fear when you're, afraid to bring up a topic with your husband? And I think normal relationships don't have fear. Normal
Exactly.
marriages aren't afraid. No, in normal marriages, you don't sit out in the car and dread walking in that front door.
Yeah,
Because you
it's
can roll with the punches and you can talk through really difficult things without anyone, exploding or getting angry or calling you names or putting you down or telling you you're ignorant. And those things don't happen in a normal marriage.
yeah, those it's like, and so it was so good for me, and that's why I said, like, it was one of the best things that ever happened to me was going to this secular camp, was just reading like what a normal relationship looks like,
Mm.
and like what healthy is. Healthy is communication. It was all the things that I actually wanted and that I knew, and it was like, wait a minute, you can actually ask for those things to exist.
Mm.
Those are things that are appropriate for interpersonal relationships with
So you
people.
knew in your gut that that's what you wanted,
Right,
but it was just never a possibility in
right,
your marriage.
right. And it wasn't, and it absolutely wasn't. So we ended up, she decided that we got separated, again, still living in the same house, separated at that time. But I was also very confident in that time of, okay, this is okay. I tried, I did the whole thing. I knew that she needed to get better, and I knew that she needed to do stuff. And if she wasn't willing to do that, then I felt free. I mean,
Mm.
I really feel like there was abandonment at that point, which is, one of the things that I'm okay with, getting divorced and stuff like that. It was just absolute abandonment. She didn't want to be married to me. There was no fruit in her life that made me think that she was even saved at that point. She was doing drugs at that point. She was going out all hours of the night and stuff like that. And it wasn't really a marriage at that point. So I ended up moving out and moving in with a friend of mine, and we were working through mediation at that time. Because I felt as like, oh, well, it seems pretty easy. We'd been married for a long time. It's 50-50 everything. I was like 50-50. I didn't try to take any. I mean, one of those things, it's like the right thing to do is to be 50-50. Like that's I felt like it was normal. I was like, well, what is the standard thing that people do? We're not going to fight this, because I think it's the honorable thing to do. I mean, I'll go my way, you go your way. And so at that point, it started an 18-month battle over what our mediation was going to be. And it just, again, it was the same things of our marriage. It's like, you're going to agree to whatever I want, or I'm going to make it life terrible for you.
This is what she's saying to you.
Yes.
Manipulation.
Right. She
Okay.
was like, well, because of you, I got you arrested. You have to do exactly what I say. It would be like, so the arrest was always over,
That's
constantly
scary.
part.
That's really scary.
Right. And she would be like, well, I remember us having a discussion when we were still in the same house. She was like, well, I'm going to call the police and tell them that you're attacking me.
Oh,
It's
wow.
like, since you got arrested before, they're going to come in here and they're going to rearrest you, or who knows, you're going to be in big trouble. You're going to get hurt,
Mm.
as a way to win an argument. I was
Wow.
like, it was like, so obviously she's not afraid of me at this point, if she's making these, threats to my face about doing it. And because she knows that I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to be nice. But like, and it would be like things like that. And I remember going to our therapist and our couples therapist and saying, what do I do when she makes these threats? What am I
Oh,
supposed to do? Am
wow.
I supposed to leave? Do I leave? Do I, and it was like, a lot of them were like, look, you don't know what she's going to do. So if she makes those threats, you just leave the house and you go. And so it started doing that. And then finally I was able to find a place to live that was really cheap. And at that time I was giving her like 95% of my income, because they still had the house and the kids were there. They were in stuff. And I was basically eating one meal a day, living in my friend's basement, and again, I'm working tech. I actually make a significant salary. but I was like eating ramen in my friend's basement one time, one meal a day, because that was all I could afford, you
Wow.
know, trying to make, ends meet. Um, and then she kept talking that she wanted to move. She needed a fresh start. We hadn't agreed to this. She was like, well, I want you to, move to this city. We'll move to the city. We'll build a house and we'll build an apartment for you over the garage, and you can live with us and help co-parent the kids. Like, in her world, I was going to move across the country, get built a small apartment above the big house that she was going to have so that I could help her co-parent. I was like, going to be this, like, I don't even know what that was. And I'd be like, no, I'm not going to do that. And I was like, look, let's get a divorce in 1 year's time. If we'll work on how we communicate and how we're co-parenting, and then in 1 year's time, we'll come together as a weird family unit and decide where we want to move. I felt like that was a super reasonable. I talked to our therapist about it and stuff like that. And they were like, yeah. It was like, because I was like, I don't know how we were going to communicate and how we were going to switch the kids between two households and stuff like that. And I don't want to add moving across the country to that deal. So she wouldn't agree to it. And then finally, in the end of the summer of one of the summers, she said, okay, well, I'll agree to a deal that we had with the mediator. And at that time I was like, well, where do we want to have the kids? Because we lived in two different places. I was working in, one city that was about 2 hours from where our house was. And I was like, well, which place are we going to live in? I was like, I can't keep commuting back and forth. I switched a job, switched work constructs so that I could be down in our hometown. I was like, well, which place do you want to live? And she wouldn't tell me. And I would be like, what school system do you want the kids in? And she wouldn't tell me. And she was like, at the end of summer, so we're getting into August, and she still has not decided which place that she wanted. I was like, look, just pick a place. We'll get in apartments, like near each other so we can help each other. But we're going to have two different households, and you just got to pick your place. And then she said, well, I need to take this trip to see some friends of mine in Tennessee. And I was like, well, the kids need to start school in 2 weeks, and we still haven't picked houses, and we still haven't registered the kids. It's like, what? And she was like, oh, well, I've got it all figured out. And the kids were with me, and it was actually on my birthday, and I handed them over to her and on her trip to go to see Tennessee. And she's like, oh, we're only going to be there for a few days. So she left on a Monday, and then I called the kids every night when they're with their mom, just to kind of talk. And I couldn't get the kids on Wednesday and Thursday and Friday.
That's scary.
And I was texting her, and I was like, what's going on? Why can't I talk to the kids? And she was like, oh, we're in bad cell service. We're on our way back. I've got a folder of the schools and stuff like that. And so then on Saturday morning, I get a phone call from her. And I was texting her. She was like, well, I'm almost back to my brother's, which was back to where we were living. Saturday. And I was like, oh, okay, well, and and in the morning I woke up on a Saturday, and she gave me a call around 10 a.m. And I'll never forget this phone call. She called me, and she was like, well, I wasn't completely honest with you. We moved to Colorado.
Whoa.
She had upped and taken my kids without me knowing, moved halfway across the country. And she basically said, I want you to move next door to us. And if you don't, and so this is the new life that I want to create. We're out here right now. I want you to come out here with us and move next door. But if you don't agree to it, then I'm going to file for divorce with cause because you got arrested for assaulting me. And so it was a final bargaining chip. And I remember hanging up that phone. I'm saying, well, this is not how this works. I remember hanging up that phone, calling the lawyers, and then it started an 18-month long protracted battle with her to try to figure out, to try to get my kids back from being halfway across the country.
Wow. Now I know a little bit about this part of the story, and you actually won, and the judge in your state was pretty upset that this had even happened.
Yeah, so it does. He was very upset in the beginning. I mean, the judge was. I don't fault the judge. The judge So she came out of the woodwork with all these sort of accusations and stuff like that in the first order, because the idea was like, were we bringing the children back right away, or are they staying where they were till the judge could make an assessment? And what my lawyer did was he argued that we should get a therapy evaluation from a child psychologist that does parenting evaluations. And because of the huge accusations that my first wife was making against me, the judge said everybody stay where they are right now.
Wait, hold on. She made new accusations
She
against
made new
you?
accusations about our life together. I mean, that were totally unhinged from the truth. Um, and so that first round, we didn't win. But honestly, I always say I felt like the judge was fair because he was getting two completely drastically different stories, and I feel like the judge should side with the possible abused person at that point if they're making accusations, because for the safety of, and typically it's going to be women. I think that's the fair way to do it. Like if you don't have any evidence one way or the other, you should always protect abused people. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's big of
Physically,
you.
physical abuse and stuff like that. So I actually don't blame the judge at all for that. And at that time I realized is like, well, this is all in God's hands. I'm going to work as best I can about this issue. And so for over the next 18 months, basically it was something my therapist said that got back to me, is like, when people lie, it's very difficult to maintain the lie,
Mm.
because you have to make new lies to match the old lies,
Mm.
to match and make that sense, and then you can't keep them straight in your mind. So over the next 18 months, like, she got caught in lie after lie after lie. And I'm a little bit of I'm super A personality. I'm really good at record keeping. And so I know that they talk, I guess you guys, the words like gray rock communication, where I do everything, all communication with her, no communication on the phone or in person. Everything's done through either text or email, and preferably email.
That's so
um,
smart.
and because it's funny things in court, the metadata on emails is actually evidence and is more solid evidence. And for her, she works very well with skating and communicating with people. If she isolates you out, she can tell you a story that sounds really good, but then when you're like, well, that, and so she'll tell a different story to each group of people, and she separates the people by saying, oh, well, I'm only letting you in on this secret, I'm only letting you in on this secret, and so that the people feel special and they don't communicate. But when you go to court, actually things come out. You can't maintain, like, you say one thing on one deposition and then your record shows something else, and then you say something else on the stand. Um, and I remember I was, I remember thinking, one of the things I need to do is, my reputation is being handed over to God now. Like, I cannot maintain my reputation. I'm hearing horrible things about me that don't match up with what I know about myself. And as long as I'm calm and peaceful and keep records and be reasonable, she will always undermine herself.
Mm.
And,
Yeah.
there's a couple of really, they're humorous now. At the time, they were not humorous, of things that she said in court that just made zero sense, that just got under people's skin. I got to the judge, and like, you know, one story is that the reason why she felt like she was supposed to go out to Colorado is she found $4,000 wrapped in a baggie on the sidewalk. And so
Wow.
she says this in court, and my lawyer was like, well, why didn't you turn it into the police? And she said, no, I took it as a sign from God that I was supposed to make the move and not um, tell my husband that we were moving, because all of a sudden there's this stuff. And my lawyer was like, well, you're supposed to, if you find money like that, you're supposed to turn it into the police. And she's like, well, I'm not turning it into the police because they're going to keep it, and I needed to keep this. So it was like, again, it was like no concept of right or wrong, or that this is what normal people would do. And just over time, this sort of kind of came out. So at the end of 18 months, I had the kids for the summer. I handed them over to get on the plane to fly back to where they were. We still hadn't had the final court order from the judge about what the outcome of this was. We've after 2 days after I'd sent my kids back on the airplane to go see their mom and to be with their mom, the judge came down and basically said the kids were moved under false pretenses.
Back 18 months before.
18 months prior.
Okay.
No. I mean, it was at that point it was like only 9 months.
Okay.
And they needed to be moved back, and
to your state,
to the state that we were in, and that we were going to share custody 50-50, because as part of the child evaluation, the interviews with the evaluator, with me and with the kid's mom, they found that there was great bonding relationship between both of us. Like, it's one of those things that for some bizarre reason, my ex-wife is actually a very kind person to the kids as younger. Now, it's gotten a little bit strange as they gotten older and got their own opinions, but for the most part, I've never been worried about her and them physically or neglect or anything like that. I think, she's actually been very kind to them, and it's part of her personality to be the best mom that she possibly can. And so when I was there, I was the brunt of most of her negative energy was on me. So the judge wanted us to move back to our original home state, share custody 50-50. She didn't like this, and so she started new court cases out in Colorado over the issues. And basically she went all the way up the court there, and she would not bring the kids back. And she almost nearly lost the kids. The judge basically ruled that she needed to come back by a certain date, or he was going to give me full custody. She ended up coming back. We did 50-50. At that point, she kept trying to get me to move back out to Colorado with her. And it just started getting extremely chaotic with the children, to the point of where she lost primary custody to me.
Oh, wow.
Because she kept fighting, and she kept moving the kids and not telling me.
So contempt of court kind of stuff.
Contempt of court. And it's like one of those things. At that point, I didn't, she was battling the court system. And so the judge gave me primary custody. But I felt like he was incredibly kind. He told her in court when this happened, he was like, this is to calm the situation. They need a stable house. Your husband's house is the most stable house at this point. This doesn't have to be forever. Please work out your stuff. Go to a parenting coordinator and work together. And so we continued to work with a parenting coordinator over the next, by that time we had another 6 or 7 months of battle, worked with a parenting coordinator over the next 9 months. And then as we got better at communicating, I petitioned for us to go back to 50-50 custody. And I think that was really important for our kids to see that, because they had gotten a lot of poison pill information that I was trying to prevent their mom from being with them. And I won't speak bad about their mom at all. Like that's...
Well, that's important. I learned when I interviewed you 1.5 or 2 years ago, you actually really gave me a really good insight into when one parent tries to turn the kids against the other, because your wife really aggressively tried to do that. And the fact that you were able to show your kids, no, I'm the one going to the court and asking for 50-50 when I've had primary custody for the last little bit. I mean, you were able to show to your kids that you weren't vindictive against their mother, that you weren't trying to pull them apart. And I was really impressed by that, but you really taught me a lot about those kinds of situations.
Yeah, I mean, and it's one of those things. I know you and I have had a lot of conversations about that particular, that the kids need to know truth. And there's this balance between knowing truth about the situation and maintaining a relationship with the other parent, that encouraging the relationship with the other parent. And, I was always of the mindset, I was always in my is my the children's mother was going to show who she was at some point, because I believe narcissistic people, people that have personality disorders, can't help it at some point. They'll turn on you no matter what, even if you're the best person in the world to them. At some point, you will see them. And so my role, again, is to be humble. My role is to show what a healthy adult does, show what, a healthy adult interacts with the opposite sex, how families are supposed to be structured, that it's really important not to isolate your family or talk bad about your family. If, as long as I'm the reasonable person, and I did the same thing in court, if I'm the reasonable person in this case, then, I think God honors that. Whether the outcome works in your favor or not, at least I can stand honorably before God on that thing. And it's the same thing. It's like, my job is not to make my kid's relationship worse with their mom. She's going to do that job all on her own. My job is to equip my children to be able to handle when things go sideways with their mom. It's like, how do you give people the ability to have boundaries? How do you give the ability to communicate about things, or to know what a healthy relationship looks like, or healthy communication looks like?
We are up to an hour. You've remarried very, very happily. You've had some, court conflict with your ex-wife. I think people want to know everything. They want to know,
Yes.
how did you even have the courage after being married to someone with, that kind of manipulative personality? How did you even have the courage to date again? How did you know that the person you dated would be safe? How did you introduce her to your children? How did that go over with your ex? All those kinds of questions. So what would be good for round 2?